Greetings and welcome to the After Show Analysis Podcast for UFC 301. As always, I'm your host, Luca Fury. Going solo this time, was going to be joined by Liam, but he had to drop out at the last minute. He'll be back next time, of course. This was a pretty fun event overall. Did have a pretty solid main card as well as the prelim portion. More importantly, it was a very nice winning night for the official bets. It was over a 14-unit winning weekend, actually, altogether. We won around 7 units, actually, I think a little bit more than that. On the UFC card, it was around 8 units, actually, and then a little over 6 units on the other MMA events. So, won four events in a row now, including 3 sweeps, won 6 of the last 7 events as well. So, finally picking up some momentum again, have a nice win streak going after a rocky February and March. Of course, that was preceded by a huge win streak from October until basically the end of January. So, overall, done very, very well, of course, but definitely was hoping to get a nice win streak going again after, like I mentioned, a rocky period there, and it seems to be happening now. So very big night here. Hopefully you tailed the official bets. Of course, if you didn't, those are available over on patreon.com/Fury's Fight Picks, as is the rest of our content. But getting into the fight recaps here, starting first with the main event of the evening. We had Alexandre Pantoja successfully defending his UFC flyweight title against Steve Erceg by unanimous decision. 2 of the judges had it 48-47, while one judge had it 49-46. Personally, I had it 48-47 for Pantoja as well. I thought Steve Erceg absolutely blew this fight in the 5th round, but also some of the other rounds as well. I was texting with one of my betting buddies throughout this card, and in the main event specifically, we kept texting back and forth. Why on earth is this man keep shooting takedowns? He had a clear path to victory going into the fight, Erceg. That was to keep the fight on the feet and outstrike Pantoja. Erceg is overall the better striker, more potent, more dangerous, more capable of getting the knockout or the finish. You saw that here in the fight as well, but we knew that going in. So if you're him preparing for this matchup, your game plan is very simple. You keep this fight on the feet at all costs and try to use your boxing advantage. And when he was doing that for moments, he was having a lot of success. That's why he won multiple rounds here. But then he would just inexplicably shoot takedowns for no reason. It wasn't like he was hurt. It wasn't like he was pressured. It wasn't like Pantoja started picking him apart in the feet and having his moment, so it was a panic takedown or something. There was literally absolutely no reason, no excuse, no justification for it. It was absolutely baffling. Now, it's one thing to do that in round 2 or round 3 or even round 4. But when it's now round 5, you maybe don't know, but are assuming anyways, and it's a safe assumption, that it's probably 2-2 in rounds, that the 5th round wins it. Why on earth are you continuing to make the same mistake? And when it comes to fight IQ, when it comes to boneheaded decisions in the cage, something I will talk about with fighters is you don't just have to be on the lookout for if they shoot themselves in the foot. Be on the lookout for how quickly they reload. And boy, Steve Erceg, this is a Call of Duty game. He has a sleight of hand perk enabled. This dude was just reloading and shooting himself in the feet repeatedly. He didn't have any feet left at the end of this contest. So you want a perfect example of fight IQ and in-cage decision-making, deciding the outcome of a bout? This was a sterling example. I have no clue what this man was doing. I have no clue why his corner was not absolutely raging at him to not shoot the takedowns. I know they said in general not to, but they should have been much more adamant about it. It was just, yeah, this was bad fight IQ more than anything else in the case of Steve Erceg. Now, on the flip side, to his credit, a lot of people were underrating him going into this matchup. A lot of people didn't think he deserved it just because he's relatively unknown, has not been in the UFC for very long, just knocked out Matt Schnell, who doesn't have a good chin, gets knocked out by a lot of people. So it's not like he had, put together a great resume to earn this title shot or anything like that. But as we talked about on the pre-fight podcast, which we live streamed as well, if, this line had actually been a bit steeper, we'd be on Steve Erceg. We were not on him, but we would have been on him if this line was steeper, if, some of the public perception was more into play here. I was thinking this line probably would have opened at least 3-1 for Pantoja, not because it deserved to be there. Again, as I said on the pre-fight podcast, I thought he deserved to be under a 2-1 favorite. But I thought based on just public perception, we would get him as a bigger favorite, and then there might actually be a dog play on Erceg to be made. Obviously, that didn't happen. He was much lower. And even still, after doing my podcast, I still got questions from people. Why is the line so low? And, well, you saw why the line was low. Again, as we talked about on the pre-fight podcast, he had a clear path to victory. And Pantoja is vulnerable. He is not one of these dominant champions who you look at and go, oh man, how can he be beat? He has incredibly shaky striking defense. Yes, he has a good chin, but that only gets you so far. He's eventually going to get cracked, and also he can get out-volumed, out-pointed, as we almost saw here. On top of that, his cardio is inconsistent, as we once again saw here. Again, something I talked about on the pre-fight pod is everyone was talking about how, oh man, he's fixed his cardio, or his cardio is so great now because he's been going in these 5-rounders and winning decisions. But here's the thing. Look at how those played out. It would be good cardio for a couple of rounds, and then he starts slowing down in maybe round 3, then looks good in round 4 again, and then slows down in round 5. Or maybe it's plays out a little bit differently in terms of which rounds he looks good in and which rounds he slows down in. But there's been a trend of sort of taking a round off, then looking good, then taking a round off, then looking good again. And we saw that once again here. So what happens when, this division, which is still kind of underdeveloped a bit, there's not a lot of great fighters, not a lot of particularly well-rounded ones, not a lot of potent finishers in it. What happens when this division develops more and we start seeing guys who can actually compete with him for 5 rounds with their own cardio being 5-round worthy, and that give and take a round just doesn't work out. Again, we almost saw it cost him here, and that was against Erceg, who's actually shown more cardio issues than Pantoja has in the past. So I think the cardio is a real concern that everyone should be noting going forward. There's a reason why I always mention in the breakdowns, and I always get flack from people going, what are you talking about? He keeps winning these 5-rounders. Again, won it tonight, but his cardio was not consistent throughout. So Pantoja, he's very tough. He's gritty. I know it's very generic things to say about a fighter, but those are some of his best attributes. And he's good in terms of control. But in terms of being dominant, in terms of being consistent round to round, fight to fight, yes, obviously he's been winning more often than not. He's the champion and defended and all that. But he has shown a lot of vulnerabilities in a lot of fights and a lot of rounds now. It's not like, again, okay, maybe there's a few fights where he showed an issue where, okay, he got rocked in this fight, but the rest of the 4 rounds and, 90% of the 1 round where he got rocked, he looked great. No, that's not the case. He's only looking great for like 60% of his fights and then losing the other 40%. That, to me, is a vulnerable champion. So I don't see him reigning for a long period of time. I think that he very well could lose his next fight or the fight after that. I would say at most he has 3 more title fights before he loses the belt. Not because I think that there's someone coming up the ranks who for sure is going to beat him, but just look at the way his fights have played out. Look at the variance fests that they have been. I just can't see these almost sort of 50-50 matchups that have gone his favor in the short term continuing to over and over go his way. It almost reminds me a little bit of Ben Henderson back in the day at lightweight, where he was constantly winning these fights. Now, to want to be clear, the difference there was he was actually winning bad decisions in some cases where he was just like straight up getting robberies. Pantoja's not been getting robberies, but in the case of Henderson, he kept winning and winning and winning. And people are like, oh man, he's so great. And I was just going like, what are you talking about? He is barely getting by the skin of his teeth over and over and over again. This is not sustainable. And then Ben went on to not just start losing, but just start losing a bunch. But like just started losing and just like couldn't win fights all of a sudden. So not to say that Pantoja is going to go on like a massive winning streak, but he has been very fortunate in terms of the variance, in terms of judging, in terms of other variables in a lot of these matchups. And I just think long term, it's not going to be sustainable for much longer. There's also, again, a developing division below him where you have fighters like Steve Erceg who came out of nowhere, who are very flawed at themselves, and yet still are able to go out there and just by the skin of their teeth barely lose to Pantoja. So I think his days, again, are kind of numbered, not because he's a bad fighter, but just because the division is going to develop here pretty soon. I think we're going to probably actually see a bit of turnover. Obviously, we've seen the Moreno matchups, the Royval matchups in the past. We've seen a lot of those because they've been kind of the only top guys for a bit now. But I think we're going to see some more Steve Ercegs kind of come out of the woodwork here and start challenging for the title as the division starts to finally pick up. Usually divisions go through trends like this where welterweight had this back in the day where it was George St. Pierre and Josh Koscheck and John Fitch at the top, and then it mixed up and we had a different few fighters. You kind of go through these trends sometimes, but it does not last forever, and we're starting to see some fresh faces move up the ranks, and thank God, because the top of this division is getting a bit stale with the repeated recurring rematches over and over. Moving down to the co-main event of the card, we had Jose Aldo successfully returning and taking on Jonathan Martinez as an underdog, getting the unanimous decision win, 30-27. We picked him on the pre-fight podcast. We also ended up having an official bet on him. For me personally, I was going to bet him bigger than I ended up betting him. I ended up betting him actually only kind of small because he looked absolutely atrocious at the weigh-ins. That cannot be understated. And I thought that also showed in the fight a bit. He did not look great here despite looking good in some regards. He clearly was slowing down about halfway through the fight. And even in the early goings, my goodness, this man's reflexes were nowhere near what they were even just a few years ago when he was fighting in the UFC before taking the semi-retirement break. As we talked about in the pre-fight pod, and this is, I guess, something I could say I got wrong, is he looked very good against Merab. He defended all the takedowns. I believe it was 16 of them. He lost a close decision at altitude. His cardio actually held up, and that was against a cardio and pace machine in Merab. And so I thought that was actually something that was to Aldo's credit, something that boded well for him here. He then had kept active, fighting in boxing, although he did not look particularly great in it. But my point was, there was no sign that he had taken a real notch down in terms of being a washed fighter. This is the first time where, again, I know he won 30-27 on all three judges' scorecards, almost got the finish in round 3. But as someone who has watched this man since his early career, the WEC days, all that back in the day, this was by far the worst he had looked in terms of his actual self. Now, he's looked worse in terms of getting finished by Max Holloway, for example, but in terms of his own performance, how his reflexes looked, how his athleticism, his speed, his explosiveness, all of that, this was just not great. His technique, on the other hand, this was some of the best it had looked in terms of his kicking attack. He finally threw leg kicks. He actually was mixing it up with the head kick. He did get a little bit predictable at one point. I was surprised that Martinez's corner did not pick up on it. Aldo repeatedly was going for the same combination where he would go left hook to right hook to the body, and then he would wait like a half second and then throw a knee up the middle to the head. I'm assuming the hope here of Aldo was by throwing the hooks to the body, obviously Martinez to defend would kind of hunch over and duck a bit into potentially a knee. And so Aldo was hoping to get him to duck into the body shots and then get the knee up the middle. It was basically a planned sequence, seemed like something that he was actually training and preparing for in advance. The thing was, he started spamming it. By the end of round 2, I think he had thrown it at least 3 times, maybe 4. I was surprised, again, that the corner Martinez was not aware of that, because, again, he threw it again in round 3 as well, and there was potential to be countered there. When you have a fighter going out there and just spamming the same thing over and over again, I mean, look at Derek Lewis versus Curtis Blades for a perfect example. Derek Lewis, not exactly someone you think of as being a strategic master or having super high fight IQ or in-cage adjustments. And even he was like, yeah, I kept seeing him leaning to that one side for the takedown, so I just went, for the haymaker uppercut, and it landed. Like, if you're going to be that predictable at the UFC level, fighters are going to usually pick up on it, or their corners are. And I was surprised in this case that Martinez and his corner did not pick up on that. Overall, though, again, Jose Aldo, 30-27 is also the score I had. I thought round 2 was the closest round of the fight. Round 3, he was not looking that great until he eventually rocked Martinez. And the fact that he went for the takedown there and then just kind of not rested on top, but wasn't particularly aggressive or potent from top position, showed you again he was tired. I mean, this was not obviously his last fight based on what he said in the post-fight interview, but potentially could be his last win in the UFC. And obviously back in Rio and everything like that, the co-main event, why not go for the stunning, flashy knockout at the end there when you have your opponent doing the chicken dance? Why go for the lame fight-sealing takedown? It was, again, kind of indicative of where he was at in terms of the performance. He didn't have that much energy left. I'm sure he realized that. Didn't want to gas himself out in the final couple of minutes and end up blowing the fight. So if that is indeed the case, I agree with the move by him. I think it was a smart strategic decision. But my point is, it just goes to show you how his cardio was really starting to falter down the stretch here. And again, this wasn't just about the cardio, because we've seen some cardio issues from him in the past in his more recent UFC fights. Well, more recent, even though they were a few years ago at this point. But for me, what was particularly concerning was his head movement, his reflexes, and his defense were just not that on point. Go watch prime Jose Aldo, or even, again, the one who had his last few recent UFC fights before this. He has some of the best reflexes and head movement in the sport. Subtle head movement, not the Anderson Silva, Forrest Griffin, where he's bobbing and weaving all over the place in dramatic fashion, but just subtle, slight head movement to barely avoid punches by an inch or so, like we used to see from prime BJ Penn, or, well, actually Anderson Silva used to do it a lot as well, just was more subtle so people didn't call it out as much. That's something that Jose Aldo was masterful at, the slight head movement to avoid punches, whether it's in the pocket or from range. wasn't really the case here. He was getting caught out of position at times, even other times where the punches from Martinez happened to miss. There were multiple spots where I was thinking, oh man, that was not very Jose Aldo looking in terms of the openings that he was leaving there. So I thought there was a bit of some sloppiness from him, a bit of some issues with the reflexes, definitely some issues with the cardio, even though overall I thought his technique and his kicking game looked some of the best that we've seen in recent years. So a mixed bag performance from him. He said apparently he's going to talk with the UFC and try to fight again with them. I didn't really know what his intentions were going into this fight. A lot of people kept saying this was his final fight in the UFC. I did not say that in my pre-fight breakdowns because, again, he had not really indicated that going in. I know it was the final fight on his contract. The question was he trying to come here, fight out the contract so that we could go on to, say, other boxing opportunities or something that the UFC wasn't allowing him to do, similar to what we saw, say, Francis Ngannou do when he fought Ciryl Gane? Or was it a case where he wanted to go out there and just have one last fight and retire from combat sports completely? Did he want to actually return to the UFC? I thought it was interesting that he chose to fight at 135 because regardless of what the situation was, unless he was going to plan to actually stay in the UFC, keep fighting and try to be a contender again, why not come back at his old division of 145, spare himself the severe cut at now 37 years old? And again, he looked disastrous on the scales. The only reason why that could make sense is if he was indeed planning to make another run at the title. So I guess I kind of believe him when he says that because his actions line up with those words. So I guess we will see what he actually decides to do here. In terms of him actually being a contender, man, I hate to say it because he's been one of my favorite fighters to watch over the years because back in the day when he was in the WC and then his early days in the UFC, he was very underrated, as a matter of fact. People did not give him credit for how extremely well-rounded and not infallible he was, but he had an incredibly difficult style to beat. It wasn't until he started to kind of not necessarily get shot at the later portions of his career, but he definitely started to hit a decline in terms of his cardio, some of his reflexes. Also started fighting much better and bigger fighters as well, guys like Max Holloway. There was a variety of reasons that led to his decline, but before that happened, man, he was one of the most close to unstoppable fighters we had in MMA. And you compare that to now, I mean, he is just an absolute shell of himself. And again, I know this to be expected considering he's, again, 37 years old, but even compared to the guy we saw against Merab in his last UFC fight before this, just not the same guy. The weigh-ins were obviously a red flag. The performance was an even bigger one. So obviously he can go out there and still win fights. I picked him going into this one, so it's not like, I'm some Jose Aldo hater or anything like that, or some person who's super critical of him at this point in time. I obviously believed in him still, but after seeing the performance, I guess my opinions haven't changed too much. I still feel kind of uncertain about him. Going into this fight, I kind of wanted to see what form he was going to be in. I was concerned he might be in bad form. And after seeing it, I don't think he's in bad form, but he's certainly not in good form either. So I think he can beat the Jonathan Martinez's of the world, but I think he's going to get a rude awakening if he tries to become a legitimate title contender again in the future. Moving on down the card here, and by the way, please share your questions and comments. I am going solo here, so if you guys would like to basically be my de facto co-host and get at me in the comments, I'm checking them here. None so far, although I realize it is a late live stream time at this point. Also, didn't give you guys much notice in terms of the announcement, less than an hour, so kind of my fault. I can only blame myself for that one, but please contribute with any questions and comments. Would love to answer them here. Moving on to the next fight, though, we had Anthony Smith scoring the only other upset on the card. He was a 6-1 underdog and gets the tap out in just 2 minutes exactly on the dot in the first round over Vitor Petrino. As we talked about on the pre-fight pod, and we were obviously wrong in this fight in terms of our prediction. We obviously went with Petrino, but as we talked about, this man was not deserving of being 6-1. In hindsight, man, kind of feel embarrassed for not actually recommending a bet on Anthony Smith. If you listen to our breakdowns, we basically sold on why you should bet him and then just couldn't pull the trigger on it. So kind of upset with myself about that. Not trying to take any credit or anything like that for being right in any way. I'm doing quite the opposite. I'm actually shaming myself for not pulling the trigger on Smith here. The writing was kind of on the wall in terms of this is the type of spot where you should take a flyer on the big underdog. We talked about all the flaws in Petrino's game. We talked about the ways he was vulnerable, the ways he could blow this fight. And he was a huge favorite, 6-1 again. So it's not like he was 2-1, 3-1 or something like that. Again, plus 180 on the Anthony Smith. it was worth it to take a shot, at least a small one on him. So definitely an error on our part, especially my part as well. I I feel like I, more than anyone, kind of sold on why I probably should have at least laid a small bet on him, and I just did not get around to it. The reason was is Anthony Smith, he's just been such an unreliable fighter himself. He obviously has not shown direct quit in terms of, just straight up turtling and giving up in fights, but once he starts facing adversity, he doesn't really battle back. He just goes into like this blatant survival mode. And Petrino going out there, probably going to try to get some early offense going, could probably hurt Smith at some point or rough him up, maybe get him down on the ground on his back, which he tried to do, obviously, led to the guillotine. And then, at that point, maybe force Smith into that survival mode. Usually Smith only has like 3-4 minutes in the tank before he starts really fading as well. So that's ultimately why I just didn't want to lay money on Anthony Smith. It was one of those situations where he goes out there, gets absolutely torched, just looks lifeless, is in complete survival mode and gets finished. It's like, man, I really just put thousands of dollars on Anthony Smith. What was I thinking? But on the flip side, when the issues, the vulnerabilities of Petrino, and you don't take the 5-1, plus 500-ish underdog against him, not going to get this opportunity probably ever again with Petrino. So it's just a missed opportunity. And like I said, kind of upset with myself. Not kind of, actually, like really upset with myself in hindsight. There's times where like, okay, you have a big upset that happens, and it's like, oh man, that was shocking. I guess in hindsight, maybe you could see how it could happen. In this case, I feel like it was just bad betting fundamentals on mine to at least not lay a little bit on Smith. So again, gotta give myself some shame for that one. The reverse of a pat on the back. Definitely no credit to myself for that fight. I feel like I kind of blew it in that regard, just like Petrino blew it in a very big way. In terms of his future, I feel the same way about him. I think the guy's kind of a flake. I thought this was going to happen to him at some point against someone. Obviously didn't think it would be Anthony Smith, but he just has too many vulnerabilities, the chin issues, the cardio issues. His fight IQ sometimes is actually good, but sometimes it also is kind of shaky, so even inconsistent in that regard. So just a guy that I was never particularly high on. And now it's unfortunate because it's a very profitable angle in MMA betting overall to try to find the first time that guys like him lose. Back in the day with people like Paige Van Zandt and Sage Northcutt, I was an expert at fading them at the perfect moments, the only times they lost. It's very, very important because then the next time they lose, they're usually not nearly the favorite they were, and sometimes they're actually now the underdog because people realize what they are. In the case of Petrino, you're not going to be seeing him as a 6-1 favorite against a decent opponent anytime soon, if ever. So the opportunity to really fade him at a great price was probably missed here. If you were one of the people who happened to do it, though, absolute props to you. Big credit. I know some people on MMA Twitter did, so props to them. Very good call on that. Saw some people even hit some nice props in that as well, over plus 1,000. So well done. Credit to those people, but shame to me myself for not pulling the trigger on Smith. In terms of Smith, though, don't really think much different about him going forward. He's a guy who has never been consistent or elite. Yes, I know he earned the title shot. Yes, I know like in the highlights they showed him beating guys like Rashad Evans, and he has wins over former top guys like Hector Lombard and that. But when he beat those guys, they were absolutely washed, completely shot. Those wins did not mean really anything at the time or even now. He's never been a guy who's actually been elite, but the UFC loves to talk about him like he is, and he loves to talk about himself like he is. I have nothing against him. I have met him personally. He's a super nice guy, very polite, well-spoken. Absolutely nothing against him on a personal level, but it just is very weird the way the UFC and himself talks about himself. It's kind of delusional, to be honest. He's a guy who's a mid-level gatekeeper. That is his peak. That's always been his peak. That's always going to be his peak, especially now that he's even older and actually regressed a little bit as well. So props to him for getting the upset like this. Absolute credit to him. Credit to all the people who bet him. But it does not make me suddenly think, oh man, Anthony Smith, he's for real. He's actually going to be a contender in this division. No, I still think he's going to be pretty much the same level of fighter that he already was. As for the next bout, we had Michel Pereira defeating Ihor Potieria by submission. Round one, just 54 seconds. Some slight controversy here. I thought ultimately they got the call right here. Yes, there was contact with the shin to the face when he went for the ridiculous backflip. Something we criticized in the pre-fight pod. Like, I don't understand why the dude keeps doing this. If you're successful, either this is going to happen, or he's going to end up with his back taken, or just going to end up reversed in some fashion. It's just, or injured in some way. It's just an incredibly foolish thing. He's done it several times now. He does not learn his lesson. Not to say that he should have been taught a lesson by being DQ'd or hit with a no contest here, but I mean, man, if you're in his camp, like, how are you not trying to drive it into this dude's head to stop doing this for a variety of reasons? If he had been punished by it here, got a DQ, maybe then he would have stopped. Maybe not, though. Who knows? But I feel like this is going to be something that probably ends up costing him at some point. We talked about it potentially costing him on the pre-fight pod, and it wasn't even for this reason. It was more about getting his back taken. This is just another reason that's unfolded now as for why he should not be doing this ridiculous maneuver. In terms of why I think it was the right call, yes, again, there was incidental contact. It was not intentional, but even if a foul is not intentional, if it is going to affect the outcome of the fight, you still have to dock it in terms of deducting a point or DQing or turning into a no contest. And what it comes down to is you have to judge how much did the foul actually affect the outcome of the fight. He got hurt. He went down. He threw a naked leg kick from punching distance. Huge mistake, something I talk about all the time. Look at any KO highlight. Like, literally go on YouTube right now and search best knockouts of any year and watch how many of them occur because a fighter who got knocked out threw a leg kick from punching distance and got effortlessly countered because their hands were down because they're throwing a leg kick in punching distance. All-time MMA cardinal sin, been happening since the olden days, still happens in the modern days, even happens at some of the higher levels, surprisingly. So big mistake by Ihor in that regard. But once he went down, that's what did the damage, that initial strike. He was a bit conscious, yes, obviously, but the shin to his face didn't really seem to affect that much. It seemed to be more sort of the collision that kind of caused most of the impact, and obviously the knee seemed to kind of hit his chest more than anything. It was more the shin that hit the face. It wasn't like the shin or the knee was what caused the knockdown or caused him to being rocked or something like that. It seemed kind of like incidental contact. The way I equate it is, what I equate it to is, say when you have a guy get knocked down and he's scrambling for a single leg and the other opponent's throwing hammer fist and rabbit punches and maybe the sideways elbows trying to get the finish, and maybe one, maybe two hammer fists kind of hit near the back of the head, sort of, but it's not like you saw that the legs directly buckle as a result. It's not like what caused the initial knockdown or the finish. It was clean, legal punches that caused the knockdown and the finish. In that situation, the refs pretty much always ignore the incidental contact. The only time I can think of that they didn't was Eric Silva against Carlo Prater. I actually bet Eric Silva destroys the dude in 30 seconds in some incidental shots that sort of maybe hit side back to the head area. Mario Yamasaki ends up DQing him in Brazil, as a matter of fact. It was insane. Lost money on that. I was so pissed. But other than that, like, the refs always ignore it. And that's why it was so absurd at the time, because you just ignore that. This, to me, again, was akin to that. I don't think that they should have DQ'd him or turned it into a no contest. Keep in mind, we had an official bet, a small play on Ihor as a big underdog. So if there's any bias, I would be saying, oh, yeah, DQ him, give us the win, or no contest, make it so he didn't have the loss. As I always point out, I am not biased in terms of my analysis. It's very important as a sports bettor, if you actually want to be elite at this, to not have that bias. I see so many people defend it and be like, well, yeah, I bet on him. Of course I'm emotionally biased towards it. That's a huge problem. A, it's a problem that you're emotionally biased. B, it's an even bigger problem that you think it's okay to be emotionally biased. You should try to be as emotionless as possible. So if there was any bias here, I'd be saying that they should have DQ'd it. I do not think that they should have DQ'd, though. I do think that they made the right call. I do not think that it had any real effect on the outcome of the fight. If they had done any kind of no contest or DQ, I would have thought that was an absolute BS lucky win in our favor. So glad that they did what they did. It seemed like they were actually considering doing a potential different outcome at one point. The commission was all talking at cage side, so glad cooler heads could prevail, and they did the right thing in the end. In terms of Michel, in terms of his future, not really much changes. I think the dude's still kind of a bonehead in the cage, as we saw here. Almost blew what would have been a very easy, dominant win for himself. One of the reasons why I know that we had the official play on Ihor was because the potential for Michel to go out and blow it with stupid things like this. So I think he's going to blow it again in the future, like he's blown it in the past with stupid bonehead in-fight decision-making. So like I talked about with Fight IQ in the Steve Erceg fight, look at how much that decided that fight. In the future, just like it has happened in the past, we are probably going to see Michel Pereira fights decided by his very poor fight IQ. So someone in the future that I'm still looking to fade if he is a huge favorite. Personally, I didn't have a bet against him in this fight. One of the handicappers and the official bets did, but in the future, I still think of him as overall fade. Even though I didn't do it in this spot, he's always a guy who I'm looking to as 3-1, 4-1. Do I actually think his opponent has a real live shot here? Because when you're looking at betting on a big favorite, you want to be looking for someone who is consistent. It's not just about, do I think they're better at these skills and check these boxes? Are they actually consistent? Are they actually capable of going out there at a high rate and showing that superiority? Or do they go out there and throw fights away with poor fight IQ, like, say, Steve Ursig tonight? He showed he was superior in certain regards. That superiority should have led him to a victory, but his inexperience and poor fight IQ, poor in-fight decision-making is what ultimately cost him the fight. So it's not just who's the better striker, who's the better grappler. It's also who's the better game planner, and also who's better at executing that game plan as well. Moving on to the next fight, in terms of game plans and executing them well, Caio Borralho, defeating Paul Craig by round 2 KO. Sorry, I barely slept last night. I'm mumbling all over the place here. I got like 1 hour of sleep, went to bed at noon, was up late researching this damn card. So the staff picks weren't out until like 1 p.m. or something like that. Slept like an hour. We had Caio Borralho defeating Paul Craig by knockout 2 minutes, 10 seconds into the second round. Caio, he's very adamant and open about how he tries to diligently research his opponents, takes a very analytical approach to the fight game. I think that's very wise from him. I have worked with UFC fighters doing tape study and analysis for them in the past. It's shocking to me how there are still, to this day, a significant portion of fighters who want nothing to do with researching their opponents, who don't want to watch tape, who don't even want to know what their opponents are about or good at. There's been fighters who I've worked with who I don't actually work with them. I literally only work with their coaches, and then their coaches just basically implement the stuff I give them into the game plan. And the fighter who's actually, I'm helping, they're never told, like, hey, your fighter you're going against specifically is bad at this thing, so we're going to try to act like they don't want to know that. Some fighters literally want to know almost nothing about their opponent, and it absolutely baffles me. Like, that is such an easy way to improve your win rate, to be informed in what your opponent brings to the table, and then be able to counter it effectively, exploit it. Like, this is what wars are won off. This is why we have spies and intelligence agencies, to sit here and be like, we don't think this country we're going to attack has nukes, but we don't know for sure because we've never looked into it. Oh, look, they have nukes. It's the end of the world. That sucks. Too bad. Like, you kind of need to know what your opponent is bringing to the table. And it is absolutely mind-blowing to me that some opponents either are not doing that at all or are not doing that to an extreme extent, especially in this day and age when you have so much tape available on everyone, HD, 4K angles and everything. I mean, it is just such a detriment to your game if you are not researching your opponents as a fighter. And on the flip side, if you are someone who's extremely good at it or extremely intense about it, like Caio is shown to be, or at least claims to be, look at the results of his fights. Look at Paul Craig, what he's good at. He's good at a few different things and not much else. And the fighters who he has beat have fallen to those very specific things because they were not prepared and educated. Not the case here with Caio. This is one of the reasons why you saw him being such a big favorite. He is a very prepared and educated fighter. He's very analytical about his opponents, looks to exploit them. And you saw that here. Paul Craig did not have success with basically anything. And basically anything that Caio wanted to do, he was able to do. Eventually got the big knockout in the second round. It was a clean knockout. Absolutely slumped him up against the cage. He looked like a completely different level of fighter. He looked every bit of the 6.5 to 1 favorite that he should have been. So it just goes to show that it's not just about the skill set. Again, we've had multiple fights here on this main card where bad fight IQ has been what costs fighters. And on the flip side, good fight IQ has maybe not necessarily straight up won the fight, because obviously Caio was a better fighter here no matter what and should have won, but it made the fight more easier, I should say, and also led to an impressive KO victory. It wasn't like, he went out, got like a, lame TKO on the mat or grinded out a boring decision. This was a highlight reel, impressive, curb stomping type of KO, and that's exactly what you should be doing as a 6.5 to 1 favorite. So I preach it all the time. Pay attention to the fighters who are actually analytical and informed in what their opponents are doing, because just like you guys, if you're preparing for bets, look at the way you're doing it. You're either doing the research yourself, where you're actually going out there and doing the tape study, grinding the hours, or you're listening to someone like me who's doing it for you and then relaying what I've seen on the tape. But either way, you're getting informed before you make your bets. You're not just blindly looking through the tape or the card, excuse me, going, oh, let's go to DraftKings. Who do we got this week? Victor Petrino, 6-1. Let's just throw a dart on him, put some money there. Like, that's not what you're doing, right? You're doing your research. You're understanding what you're getting into, what opponents are good at, what the style matchup is, what the potential exploits are for the fighter that you're looking to bet. I don't understand why, if you're the fighter who's actually going to be the one competing, you wouldn't exhaust every possible resource you have to become as knowledgeable as possible on your opponent. So again, I know I'm kind of a broken record, but I cannot stress enough. Pay attention to the fighters who are educated about their opponents. It absolutely makes a difference. And also pay attention to the fighters who are actually good at executing their game plans in the cage. Maybe in the case of Steve Erceg, he's always going to be a guy who shows he can hang with the elite, but never actually gets those big wins because he's constantly just making stupid, foolish mistakes. Again, look at Michel Pereira. We talked about this since his early days in the UFC years ago. And years later, he's still making the same bonehead mistakes that have cost him. Like, these are people who get punched in the head for a living. You're not always getting, the sharpest tools in the shed here. Like, a lot of times, these are fighters who have character flaws and defects that cause them to become a fighter. They're not super intelligent people sometimes. We've obviously had intelligent fighters. I'm not saying they're all boneheads, but don't be surprised when someone who takes the career path of getting punched in the head for a living doesn't do the smartest things in the cage. Also, don't be surprised if someone who at one point was smart and intelligent over the course of their career after getting CTE becomes not intelligent. That's kind of expected. You should actually be surprised if someone gets smarter throughout their career or suddenly gets, much smarter than they were ever in the past, fight to fight. Like, that's not something that usually happens. If anything, it's a downward trajectory where they get punch drunk near the tail end and get CTE in that. So again, I know I'm a broken record, but pay attention to fighters who are educated about their opponents. It makes such a big difference. And this card was one of the best examples of that. And with that aside, that will do it for the main card now. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the card as well as this post-fight edition of the podcast. And hopefully you made some money on it as well. It was a good card for betting. Again, overall for our official bets, we did quite well on the weekend, made over 14 units, including 8 units on the UFC, over 6 units then on the non-UFC MMA cards. Won 4 events in a row now, including 3 sweeps. Won 6 of the last 7 events as well. So finally picking up some nice momentum again. Hopefully you guys are tailing those. If not, head over to patreon.com/FuriousFightPicks. All of our bets are there. They're all third-party tracked and verified as well. Also have a bunch more content like this, pre-fight breakdowns, fighter analysis, fighter video breakdowns, staff pick articles, written content, tape study notes, you name it. So check it all out again at patreon.com/FuriousFightPicks. That aside, I'm going to head out of here, try to get more than 1 hour of sleep tonight. Hopefully you guys have a good rest of your weekend. Have fun if you celebrate Cinco de Mayo. Other than that, until next time, I'm Luca Fury, and thank you for listening.